right, just departed Pine Mountain over the Tuolumne River heading into the Yosemite Valley. I got backseat Jim Zellers. Jim is a longtime big mountain snowboard pioneer in my eyes. I think back to when I was 11 years old and I got my first snowboard video on VHS from my parents, and one name that I will never forget was Jim Zellers. We're headed into the Yosemite Valley to talk about a descent that Jim planned and spent a lot of time behind.
Thanks for having me, Mike. And this is kind of the perfect time to go because With Half Dome doesn't form up very often with snow conditions that are conducive to ride. This is one of the years where it's actually really forming up.
We're talking about Half Dome on this mission, and you've got quite a history that led up to that. Why don't you fill me in on a bit of your past?
So yeah, I grew up in the Bay Area in California, and in the 70s, and that was a time when skateboarding was booming, and skiing was still super popular, easy to get to. Lake Tahoe from there at the time, not much traffic, and so those were kind of the two things growing up that were really prominent. Being so involved in skateboarding, then snowboarding became a natural progression because a lot of the snowboard companies, which there was just a couple of them at the time, Barfoot and Sims out in the west, and Burton back east. It stemmed from either surfing and or skateboarding, and so it was just easy since we already skied to just combine the two. And this would have been late 70s, like 1978, and just really got into it. And at that time, no ski resorts allowed you up on the lift, so we would just hike. Essentially, then the foundation of snowboarding starts in the backcountry because that was the only place we could go at the time. So you were just hiking around. A little different back then, of course. It was moon boots and strap your feet to a rubber strap on a snowboard. So anyway, yeah, grew into just hiking and everything. And then by the early 80s, some of the resorts started to allow it. The bindings got a little better and really launched into it. And it was also at that time I entered into a group of people when I was at the University of Nevada in Reno, and there was an old traditional rock climbing class that had been going for many, many years. And so I entered into that, met a lot of great people in there, including like Tom Bird and my wife Bonnie were in the class, as well as many others. And as we got really into rock climbing and snowboarding was growing, there came a time when I wanted to see how I could combine the two. And that's kind of what, the eventuality was. As snowboarding got more and more popular, we were able to come into it early. It would have been Bonnie and myself and Tom, and started off with Avalanche Snowboards that was based out of South Lake Tahoe. And they were pumping out some great boards. They were one of the few companies on the West Coast, along with Sims and Barfoot at the time. And with a small community, you were able to be in the middle of innovation and in the middle of technical developments as well. And so it was a really fun time to be there. As the sport grows and people start just pumping all their attention into the sport, we started to just travel. And it seemed like in the winter, every month or two, another ski resort would open up in Utah or Colorado or wherever, and we would just hit the road and go visit and go to these other resorts. And at the same time, the rock climbing was, all summer long, and that's what we would do. And rock climbing just got more and more ingrained into everything we did. And we're spending 2 to 3 months a year in Yosemite climbing. All this while, the only way to really make a living at snowboarding was go to competitions. But eventually, when we broke away in 1 year at the Worlds, it was just about as bad as it could be with politics behind the scenes. And we decided, I decided, I'm done. I'll never compete again. And I just want to combine climbing and snowboarding. Travel, do stories and videos. And our sponsor said, you can't do that. Nobody can just travel and shoot films and pictures and think they're going to make a living out of this. At the time, that was all the inspiration I needed. Like, oh, you telling me I can't do this? This is awesome.
Yes.
We got this. So yeah, that's kind of how it progressed. Left the whole scene in that year would have been 88, 89 that winter, and just did a bunch of backcountry stuff. We were pretty local, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and then at the end of the season, we spent a month up in Alaska in the Ruth Gorge, camping out, hiking and snowboarding, and then we went right to the Southern Sierras and did all the big alpine ice routes. It just, the whole idea blew up, and it was one of those strange moments where people took notice in a cool way. Like, people were actually interested. It wasn't just flashy. It was like, oh, this is kind of intriguing. Like, what are you doing next year?
Yeah.
So then it built, and we were able to, again, when I say we, I mean Tom, Bert, Bonnie, Leary at the time, my wife now, and myself. So yeah, then we were able to just start writing our own way of going about it. I gotta admit, you don't know what's happening when you're doing it. You're just sort of doing this thing, and then you go, wow, a year, 2, 3, 10, 20 years later, people will recognize it. But at the time, it just seemed like the right way to go. You just, you had no other direction. So in some ways, and it was an odd feeling, we were in a fringe sport doing a really fringe thing, so it was so off to the side.
Yeah.
And me especially, because I didn't do a lot of the big films. I just wanted to keep riding and being in the mountains like that. So yeah, I was a little on the periphery on that. Yeah.
So then, bring it to Yosemite. You had this idea. Where did the idea just spawn Half Dome? Like, what brought that on? What spawned that? What made you start thinking about it and sort of starting to figure out the logistics around Half Dome?
Yeah. So essentially, never really thought of Half Dome as that's going to be my line. But when we were climbing down there was an older climber, Werner Braun, lives in the valley, and Werner every year would go and ski the couloir in off of Glacier Point Apron, and I thought, wow, that would be a great line, but it doesn't often form up because it comes down so low. And so I just kind of set my sights on, like, well, what is possible here? And then my wife and I, Bonnie, had climbed the regular route in Half Dome, which is like an overnight route, and then on the hike down, on the cables, I was like, wow, we could snowboard this. So then we went and did Half Dome again a few years later, and I brought an inclinometer, and I measured 47 degrees was the steepest. And I thought, well, most people can do that. So then it just spurred it on as an idea. And so I just kept thinking about it, doing it, doing a little bit of research, but there just was no information. There's nothing I could do to get anybody to buck anything up that would make any sense.
Right.
And I say it that way because when I asked, our avalanche teacher, Bill Glued up in Juneau, hey, how does snow stick to rock? He goes, oh, no one's ever studied that. I'm like, but if you were to think about it, he goes, oh, I don't know. No one ever looks at that. I'm like, okay. So I call the rangers in Tuolumne in the winter, and I say, hey, I'm going to traverse over the Sierra, and I love the domes. How does the snow stick to the domes? They go, stay away from the domes.
Oh, man.
I'm like, no, I'm gonna, but I'm like, does it stick to the domes? He goes, stay away from the domes. I'm like, all right, I'm not getting anywhere there. And ironically, I was in Truckee one day in the early 90s, and I was at the store, and I ran into Jerry Dugan. And Jerry Dugan, who produced that film, Critical Condition, and filmed it, and was with us in Japan. Jerry said, hey, today is my mountain flight.
Oh, man.
And I go, where are you going? He goes, oh, I got to go south over the Sierra. I go, would you go to Yosemite? He goes, I might. Because you want to go? I go, yes, I do. So I went right to the airport and jumped in the back seat with him, and so we flew in, and I said, circle Half Dome. They're like, why do you want to look at Half Dome? I'm like, no reason. And I was able to take a couple of pictures and go, okay, it's not in shape, but there is snow on the cable. And that was really the first time And that would have been 93 or 94.
Crazy.
That I saw that and did that. So then the seed was planted at that point, like Half Dome is doable. There's snow on it, not enough to ride, but it's doable.
Yeah.
I see it. I see how it can work. Yeah, so the next thing was I need a partner. I don't need for them to snowboard, but I need for them to spot me, and we should be taking pictures. So Richard Leversey, an old climber from the west side of the Sierra, and somebody who spent a ton of time in Yosemite Valley, said, let's do it. You know, he was so good about keeping all of his projects a secret. We called it the Half Brain Project, and we would constantly reference it as, yeah, you just need half a brain to be able to pull this off. So Leversey was really good at keeping his projects a secret. Like, we're flying over the Widow's Tears. He was one of the first to climb that. And he replaced all of Warren Harding's bolts on El Cap, which is just to our left. So anyway, he was a great partner, and so we just studied it, spent time, and we would look at the weather patterns and say, oh my God, it just snowed, let's go down. There was no way to get an idea of Half Dome from afar. You would have to actually hike to the base of the cables because you couldn't see the bottom of the cables from anywhere but the bottom of the cables.
Yeah.
So we would just go down and hike in and get to the base and look up and say, nope, not this year, it's not good enough, and then turn around. And that's kind of how it went for years. And we didn't really know what we were looking for at all. We just did the snow stick, and okay, there's snow, there's no snow, and we would just back and forth. So every year I would come down on the right storm cycle and come in, and some days it looked maybe doable. One year it had a big glide crack in it, and that all avalanched. It became a really difficult snow science project, and I didn't have the info to make the call, and I just was confused. And it was one day when I had come home at night, parked my truck, got out the next morning, and as I was clearing the snow off, it had snowed that night, and I was clearing it off the next morning, and I can't brush it off, and I start scraping, and the snow is stuck, and then it goes to ice, and then the ice is clinging to my windshield, and I noticed that my windshield's like probably 50 degrees, and I'm like, wow, that's what I need for Half Dome to work, is this windshield effect. So the dome, if I could imagine it, going in at a certain temperature and the right wet weather comes in and eventually gets colder and builds up enough, then I would have what I needed. Eventually, I found a snow pit on Donner's Summit on a slab that was facing the same way, a little bit lower elevation by about 800 feet than Half Dome, and about the same pitch on the same type of granite. So I just kept digging a pit there and then snowboarding that line that was maybe only like 200 feet long. And that's when I realized that this is doable. This is very doable. So then we just got on weather trackers and just followed everything and followed every weather we could. Every pattern, every storm, every rainstorms were probably the most important. So yeah, that's kind of the path that we took when we did this whole thing.
And so the line, were you actually riding the cable?
Yeah, so the cables are east facing and put up in, I believe, 1874 by George Anderson. He was a Norwegian mason guy or lumberjack or something like that. So George put it up, and I'd also looked and found that, there's only been 4 deaths of people falling off, so how dangerous can it be? So that, sort of became the deal of checking out Half Dome. And as you can see on Subdome right now, Half Dome's in. Yeah, somebody should be up there.
Oh my gosh.
That's about as good as it gets. Because I've seen it with more snow. That's my first glimpse right now. I've seen it with more snow, and it's a little more scary. But that upper wind-loaded top,
yeah,
that gets a little unnerving.
So you rode down into the saddle here, and what are you calling each of these? So you got the main dome where the cables go up on the backside.
Subdome is this one below the cables, below the saddle. And you got to get to the top of that before you can look up the cables and see it. And so you get to the bottom, you look up, sometimes it's good. One time I saw an avalanche. I can see glide cracks on it right now. Those are concerning, but not the worst thing. So we went through every condition, and I mean, even one time Richard couldn't go, and my wife Bonnie said, "Okay, I'll go up with you." But she was 6 months pregnant, so it was a little trying.
But did you make it up with her? Or how
We made it to the base.
To the base.
And there was a huge glide crack.
Oh,
and
gosh.
I sort of like start to go towards the dome. She goes, I'm 6 months pregnant. You're not going up. I'm going to divorce you right now if you go up there. I'm like, I'm just looking. And I go to take a picture, and the whole left side cuts loose and breaks off. So
look at that view.
It took a while to figure it out, but it didn't matter if it was in shape or not each time, because from the base of Half Dome back to the valley floor is some of the best, most spectacular snowboarding I've ever been able to do.
So you've summited this thing, and the tall tale is that you are the only snowboard descent down Half Dome, whether we'll claim it or not. But that's a pretty incredible feat. And so since then, and in the interim, what has happened up here? Do people still try to tackle this? What's happened since your day?
Yeah, I mean, before me, Eric Perlman came up here and he had to rappel a couple times to ski it. But then after I did this in March of 2000, it stood just sort of quiet for a long time. And then in the late teens, I met a kid on the chairlift in Squaw, Palisades now. And he said, "Hey, I'm going to Half Dome tomorrow, ride it." And I was just random guy on a chairlift, so he didn't know to ask any questions, and I figured I'd just listen to him talk about his plan and not disrupt it. And he got up to where the upper glide crack is, and there's a exfoliation step about 2/3 up, and it was super drummy and hollow, and apparently, as the story goes, he turned around there. That's all I heard. I never met him again. And then 2 years ago, 2 skiers came up. One guy that lives down here, and just nailed it. He called me on the hike in and said, "Hey, I just got your number, and I heard you did this, and I'm like on my way in. And it seems weird down low." I go, "Don't worry, just get to the base and make the call. Don't even make any assumptions until you see the base of the dome." That's what I know. And I just haven't heard if anybody else has put the time and effort in.
Yeah.
Just takes a lot of effort.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty incredible, and I think it's an awesome feat to have under your belt. It's probably pretty nostalgic every time you're down here to look at this thing.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, especially flying around it right now, is like, that looks awesome, and I'll never do it again.
Yeah.
Like, I really don't. The training it takes is more than I want to put in these days, but it sure looks cool.
Incredible feat.
Yeah.
Well, job well done. It's nice to have you backseat telling your story of this massive piece of rock here in the Sierras.
Oh yeah. Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks for showing it to me on a day that somebody should be riding it.